The sun hadn't yet broken over the tobacco fields of Wellington Plantation when Samuel's shovel struck something that sang differently than rock. It was a sound he'd never heard before, metallic, hollow, promising. He froze mid-swing, the Virginia clay still clinging to the iron blade, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. Around him, the world continued its brutal rhythm. The crack of overseers' whips echoed across the red hills. The songs of field workers rose and fell like prayers that never reached heaven. The smell of tobacco leaves drying in the June heat mixed with sweat and blood and desperation. But Samuel heard none of it. He was listening to that sound, that impossible, dangerous sound. He glanced over his shoulder. The nearest overseer, a gaunt man named Hutchins with eyes like winter stones, was occupied with a dispute near the southern fence line. The other slaves worked with their heads down, as they always did, moving through rows of green like ghosts who'd forgotten they were once human. Samuel knelt, his knees sinking into the soft earth beside the dried creek bed where Master Wellington had sent him to clear debris. The creek had run dry 3 summers ago, leaving behind a scar in the landscape that nobody paid attention to anymore. Nobody except Samuel, who'd been assigned the thankless task of preparing the area for a new fence line. His calloused fingers scraped away dirt and small stones. Then he saw it, a glimmer, faint but unmistakable, like a star had fallen and gotten trapped beneath Virginia soil. Gold. Not much, just a thin vein running through exposed rock, but enough to make his heart hammer against his ribs so hard he thought it might break through. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Samuel covered it immediately, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. 42 years of slavery had taught him many things, but the most important lesson was this: never let them see what you're thinking. Never let them see what you found. Never let them see hope in your eyes, because hope was the most dangerous thing a slave could possess. He worked the rest of that day with mechanical precision, his mind racing beneath a carefully constructed mask of exhaustion. When the sun finally began its descent behind the plantation house, that massive structure of white columns and false dignity, Samuel joined the line of workers trudging back toward the slave quarters. The quarters were a collection of wooden shacks that leaned against each other like tired old men. Samuel shared his with 7 others. Moses, who'd lost 3 children to fever, Ruth, whose songs could make grown men weep, young Thomas, barely 16, with scars from the auction block still fresh on his back, and 4 others whose names and stories formed the fabric of their collective survival. That night, Samuel lay on the rough wooden boards that served as his bed, staring at the gaps in the roof where moonlight filtered through. Around him, the others slept the sleep of the exhausted, their breathing creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. But Samuel couldn't sleep. His mind churned with possibilities, each one more dangerous than the last. Gold on plantation land belonged to Master Wellington, just as surely as the slaves who worked it. To take it would mean death, a slow, public death designed to terrify anyone else who might consider theft. To reveal it would mean nothing, perhaps an extra ration of salt pork, perhaps nothing at all. But to trade it, that was different. For 3 weeks, Samuel returned to the creek bed in the darkest hours before dawn. He would slip from the quarters like smoke, moving between shadows, every sense alert for the night patrol. Master Wellington employed 2 men to watch for runaways during the dark hours, but they were lazy and predictable, making their rounds with the enthusiasm of men who'd rather be sleeping. Samuel knew their patterns. He knew which dogs slept deepest, which boards creaked loudest, which paths offered the most cover. 42 years had taught him the geography of his prison in intimate detail. At the creek bed, he worked by moonlight and memory, using a bent spoon he'd stolen from the plantation kitchen. The gold came up in flakes and dust, tiny pieces that he collected in a tin cup buried beneath a flat stone. It wasn't much. Even Samuel, who knew nothing about mining or geology, understood that. But it was real. It was proof. And proof, he thought, might be enough. By the 4th week, his tin cup was half full. By the 6th, it weighed heavy in his hands when he lifted it from its hiding place. The vein seemed endless, running deeper into the rock face than his primitive tools could follow. How much was there? Enough to make a man rich, enough to build an empire, enough to buy freedom. That was when everything changed. It was a Thursday evening, the sky still holding the last purple light of dusk. Samuel had convinced himself he could make one more trip before full darkness fell. He was wrong. He didn't hear Hutchins approach. The overseer moved with surprising stealth for a man his size. Samuel only became aware of his presence when a voice, cold as January rain, spoke from the shadows. "Working late, are we, Samuel?" The tin cup was in Samuel's hands. The gold dust caught the dying light, shimmering like evidence of impossible dreams. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the two men stared at each other across the dried creek bed. Hutchins's eyes widened. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Samuel watched understanding bloom across the overseer's face like poison flowers opening to the sun. "Well," Hutchins finally whispered, his voice trembling with something that might have been greed or fear or both. "Well, well, well." Samuel said nothing. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only weapon available to the powerless. "Master Wellington's going to want to see this," Hutchins continued, taking a step forward. "He's going to want to see this very much indeed." That night, Samuel didn't sleep at all. He sat on his wooden bed, watching the moonlight shift across the floor, listening to the breathing of his fellow prisoners and planning. By morning, he knew what he had to do. It was dangerous, perhaps suicidal, but then again, simply being alive on Wellington Plantation was dangerous. At dawn, before the work bell rang, Samuel did something unprecedented. He walked up to the plantation house and knocked on the back door. The house slave who answered, a woman named Caroline with grey threading through her hair, stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "What are you doing? You want to get yourself killed?" "I need to see Master Wellington," Samuel said quietly. "Tell him Samuel has information about gold on his property. Tell him it's worth his time." Caroline's eyes went wide. "You've gone mad," she whispered. "The heat's finally broken your mind." "Please," Samuel said, "just tell him." 20 minutes later, Samuel stood in a room he'd never seen before, Master Wellington's private study, with books lining walls and a massive desk made of dark wood that probably cost more than 20 human lives. The master sat behind that desk, his face flushed with morning whiskey and curiosity. Hutchins stood in the corner, his expression a mixture of resentment and anticipation. "My overseer tells an interesting story," Master Wellington said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of Virginia aristocracy. "Something about you and gold in my creek bed. I'm trying to decide if this is theft or something else entirely." Samuel kept his eyes down, his posture careful, submissive enough to avoid punishment, but not so broken as to appear defeated. "Not theft, Master. Discovery. There's gold on your land, a vein running deep under the old creek bed. I found it by accident, clearing as you ordered. And you've been collecting it, it wasn't a question. Yes, Master, as proof, to show you it's real." Wellington leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with something hungry. "How much?" "Enough to know there's more, much more. The vein runs deep, deeper than I could follow. Could be nothing, could be everything." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of a clock somewhere and the sound of Wellington's breathing growing heavier. Samuel could feel Hutchins' stare burning into the back of his neck. "Show me," Wellington finally said. "Show me right now." "I will," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite his hammering heart. "But first, I have a request." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Wellington's face darkened like a storm rolling in. A request? You, a slave, have a request? This was the moment, the precipice, the point beyond which there was no return. Freedom, Samuel said simply. For me and 49 others. In writing sealed by the county judge, take us off your property ledgers, give us our papers, let us walk away free. I'll show you where the gold is. Every vein, every place I found it. You'll be rich beyond measure, and we'll be free. The laughter started as a chuckle deep in Wellington's chest, then grew into something wild and uncontrolled. Hutchins joined in, their mirth bouncing off the book-lined walls like cruel echoes. Samuel stood motionless, his face a mask, waiting for the storm to pass. When Wellington finally caught his breath, he wiped tears from his eyes. You've got nerve, I'll give you that. 40 years of breaking your back in my fields, and suddenly you think you're a businessman. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking. Tell me why I shouldn't have Hutchins flay the skin from your bones right here, right now. Because you're curious, Samuel said quietly. Because you've been losing money on tobacco for 3 years running. Because your creditors in Richmond are getting impatient. Because your son gambles away more than this plantation produces. And because you know that if there's real gold on this land, it could change everything. The smile faded from Wellington's face. His jaw tightened, and for a moment Samuel thought he'd miscalculated, pushed too far, revealed too much knowledge about matters slaves weren't supposed to notice. But Wellington didn't call for the whip. Instead, he stared at Samuel with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not property, but a man who'd been watching, listening, understanding all along. 50 people, Wellington said slowly. You're asking me to write off nearly a third of my workforce. I'm offering you wealth that makes human property look like pocket change. And master, you know as well as I do, we're getting older, harder to manage, less profitable. You've been thinking about selling some of us south anyway. This way, you lose nothing and gain everything. Wellington's fingers drummed on the desk, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to measure the weight of possibilities. Outside, the plantation was coming to life, the work bell ringing, voices calling, another day of suffering beginning like all the others. Even if I agreed, Wellington said, you could be lying, could be leading me to nothing, could be the ramblings of a sun-touched fool. Samuel reached into his shirt and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He stepped forward slowly, placed it on the desk, and unwrapped it. Gold dust and small flakes spilled across the polished wood, catching the morning light streaming through the windows. Wellington's breath caught. His hand trembled as he reached out, fingers hovering over the gleaming particles as if afraid they might vanish at his touch. There's more, Samuel said. Much more. But that's all you'll see until we have an agreement, in writing, legal and binding. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of an abyss. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat trickling down his spine despite the morning cool. Everything, 50 lives, 50 futures, 50 souls, balanced on whatever happened in the next few moments. Wellington looked up, and Samuel saw something shift in the master's eyes. Greed had won over pride, possibility over control. I'll draft the papers, Wellington said quietly. But there are conditions. You show me the gold today. If it's real, if there's enough to justify this madness, then I'll take the documents to Judge Pemberton tomorrow for sealing. But if you're lying, if this is some elaborate scheme, I'll make an example of you that people will talk about for generations. Agreed, Samuel said without hesitation, and you choose the 49 others. But they stay on the plantation, working as normal, until the papers are signed and sealed. No word of this to anyone until it's done. If there's even a whisper, the deal is off, and you all hang. Samuel nodded. One more thing, Master. I want it in the contract. We get safe passage north. 24 hours to clear Virginia without being hunted as runaways. Wellington's lip curled. You negotiate like a white man. I almost admire it. He pulled out paper and began to write. Fine. 24 hours. After that, you're fair game if you haven't crossed into Maryland. The rest of that morning passed in a blur of tension and terrible hope. Samuel watched as Wellington drafted the agreement in his careful, educated script. The master called for witnesses, 2 white men from neighboring plantations who owed him favors and asked no questions. They signed where Wellington indicated, their signatures making the impossible incrementally more real. By noon, Samuel found himself walking through the fields with Wellington, Hutchins, and 4 armed men. The other slaves watched from a distance, confusion and fear written on their faces. What transgression had Samuel committed? What punishment awaited? They reached the dried creek bed as the sun climbed toward its apex. Samuel's legs felt like water, his mouth dry as dust. Everything depended on the next few minutes. There, he said, pointing to the spot where he'd first heard that singing sound 6 weeks ago. Dig there, about 3 feet down, near the rock face. The armed men looked to Wellington, who nodded. They began to dig, their shovels biting into the red clay. 5 minutes passed. 10. Samuel felt Hutchins's eyes boring into him, felt the weight of weapons trained on his back. Then one of the shovels hit rock, and the sound, that metallic, hollow, promising sound, rang out across the creek bed. Careful now, Wellington commanded, his voice tight with anticipation. They cleared away more dirt, exposing the rock face, and there, running through the stone like veins of fire frozen in time, was gold. Not dust, not flakes, a visible seam, thick as a man's thumb in places, snaking deeper into the earth than the eye could follow. Wellington dropped to his knees in the dirt, his fine clothes forgotten. His hands shook as he touched the vein, traced its path with trembling fingers. "My God," he whispered, "my God in heaven." Hutchins had gone pale. The armed men stared, their weapons lowering as they too knelt to look closer. One of them pulled out a knife and chipped at the rock, freeing a chunk of gold-threaded stone the size of a hen's egg. "There's more," Samuel said quietly. 3 other places along this old creek bed, each with veins like this. I can show you." Wellington looked up at him, and Samuel saw something he'd never seen before in a white man's eyes when looking at a slave. Respect mixed with fear. The master understood now that Samuel could have kept this secret, could have worked it at night for years, could have bought his own freedom a dozen times over through careful sales to passing traders. Instead, he'd gambled everything on this single, audacious play. "Show me," Wellington breathed. "Show me everything." They spent the afternoon moving along the dried creek bed, Samuel pointing out each location he'd found. Each spot yielded the same result, veins of gold running through the rock, waiting to be extracted. Wellington's greed transformed into something close to mania. He paced and muttered calculations, his mind clearly racing through the mathematics of sudden wealth. As the sun began its descent, painting the Virginia sky in shades of orange and red, they stood at the 4th and final location. Wellington turned to Samuel, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow morning, first light, we ride to Judge Pemberton. You come with me. We'll have the papers sealed before noon, and by tomorrow night, you and your 50 will be across the county line." "I need to give you the names," Samuel said. "The 49 others." Wellington pulled out the contract from his jacket. "Write them here, in the margin, if you can write." "I can," Samuel said, taking the offered pen. Another thing slaves weren't supposed to know, another secret kept hidden. He wrote carefully, clearly, his hand steady despite the weight of what he was doing. Moses, Ruth, young Thomas, names upon names, each one a life, a story, a soul he was trying to save. When he finished, Wellington took the paper back and studied it. "You're taking the oldest ones," he observed, "the ones I'd have trouble selling anyway. Clever. I'm taking the ones who've earned their freedom," Samuel replied. "The ones who've given you 40 years, 50 years. The ones who deserve to die as something other than property." Wellington said nothing to that, just folded the paper and tucked it back into his jacket. That night, Samuel gathered the 49 in the shadows behind the largest quarters. They came silently, confused and frightened, wondering why Samuel had summoned them in the dark when such gatherings could mean the whip. He told them everything, the gold, the bargain, the contract that would be sealed tomorrow. At first they couldn't comprehend it. Freedom was a word so foreign, so impossible, that hearing it spoken aloud felt like blasphemy. "You're telling us," Moses said slowly, his voice rough with emotion, "that tomorrow we walk away, just walk away." "If Wellington keeps his word," Samuel replied. "If the judge seals the papers, if nothing goes wrong between now and then." "That's a lot of ifs," Ruth whispered. "It is," Samuel agreed, "but it's more hope than we had yesterday." They sat in silence for a long time, 50 people who'd never dared to dream, suddenly confronted with the possibility of something beyond suffering. Some wept quietly, others sat stone-faced, afraid to believe. Young Thomas clutched Samuel's hand like a drowning man gripping driftwood. "Why us?" someone asked from the darkness. "Why these 49 and not others?" "Because you're the elders," Samuel said, "because you've survived the longest, suffered the most, and deserve freedom more than anyone. And because—" he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because Wellington will miss you least. I had to be practical. I had to choose who he might actually let go." It was a harsh truth, but they understood. Survival had always required harsh calculations. "What about the others?" Ruth asked. "The young ones, the strong ones still in the fields? I pray this opens a door," Samuel said. "I pray that if this works, maybe others find their own paths to freedom. Maybe knowing it's possible changes something. But I could only save who I could save." They dispersed before dawn, each returning to their sleeping spaces to wait for the sun and whatever it would bring. The morning arrived wrapped in mist that clung to the red hills like reluctant ghosts. Samuel stood near the stables, dressed in the cleanest clothes he owned, which wasn't saying much, watching the plantation house for signs of movement. His stomach churned with anxiety. Everything depended on Wellington keeping his word, on the judge agreeing to seal the papers, on 1,000 small things aligning correctly. The front door opened and Wellington emerged, already dressed for travel. He saw Samuel and gestured impatiently. "Get in the wagon. We leave now." The ride to the county seat took 3 hours along rutted roads that wound through forests of pine and oak. Wellington said nothing for most of the journey, his face set in concentration. Samuel sat in the back of the wagon, watching the landscape pass. This land that had been his prison for 4 decades, suddenly feeling different, charged with the possibility of departure. They reached the town of Fredericksburg as church bells rang 10 o'clock. The county courthouse stood at the center of the square, a brick building that represented law and order, though Samuel knew that law and order meant very different things depending on the color of your skin. Judge Pemberton was a heavy man with white hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent his life dispensing justice from a position of unquestionable authority. He greeted Wellington warmly, offered him whiskey, then finally noticed Samuel standing in the corner. "You brought one of them with you?" Pemberton asked, surprise evident in his voice. "He's part of the business," Wellington said, pulling out the contract. "I need you to seal this, make it legal and binding." Pemberton took the document, and his eyebrows rose steadily as he read. "Matthew," he said, using Wellington's first name, "have you lost your mind? You're freeing 50 slaves?" "I'm making a business transaction," Wellington replied coolly. "One that will make me wealthier than tobacco ever could. But just seal it, Thomas. I know what I'm doing." The judge read through the document again, more carefully this time. Samuel stood perfectly still, barely breathing, watching 2 white men decide his fate with the stroke of a pen. Finally, Pemberton shrugged, pulled out his seal, and pressed it into hot wax at the bottom of the page. "It's done," he said, "though I think you're making a mistake that'll haunt you." Wellington took the document, now official and binding under Virginia law, and turned to Samuel. "Satisfied?" "Yes, master," Samuel said quietly, though the word master felt strange on his tongue now, almost archaic. They returned to Wellington Plantation as afternoon shadows lengthened across the fields. The other slaves had been told nothing, forced to work another day in ignorance while their fate hung in balance. But as the wagon rolled up the main path, Samuel saw them watching from the fields, saw the question in their eyes. Wellington called for all the slaves to gather in the yard between the main house and the quarters. It was unusual. Such gatherings typically meant punishment or announcement of new rules. They came slowly, fearfully, forming a loose crowd of perhaps 150 souls. Samuel found Moses, Ruth, and Thomas in the crowd. He caught their eyes, gave the smallest of nods. Wellington stood on his porch, the sealed document in his hand, and addressed the assembled slaves. "I have an announcement," he began, his voice carrying across the yard. "Today I have legally freed 50 of you. When I read your name, you are to pack whatever belongings you have and prepare to leave this plantation. You have until dawn tomorrow to depart Virginia. After that, the agreement protecting you expires." Silence. Complete, shocked silence. Then Wellington began reading names. Moses Johnson, Ruth Allen, Thomas Carter. As each name was called, the person would stagger slightly, as if physically struck. Some fell to their knees. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they'd heard. The slaves whose names weren't called looked on with expressions mixing joy for their fellows and despair for themselves. When Wellington finished the list, he folded the paper and looked directly at Samuel. "You have your freedom. Use it wisely. And Samuel, thank you for making me a rich man." It was the first time in 42 years that Wellington had thanked him for anything. The rest of that day and night passed in a chaos of emotion. The freed slaves gathered their meager possessions: a spare shirt, a treasured spoon, a small carving, a letter from a loved one sold away years ago. So little to show for lives spent in bondage. The other slaves came to say goodbye, creating a wake-like atmosphere of joy and sorrow intertwined. Families were being split, friends separated. Some who remained behind were angry. Why these 50 and not them? Others understood the bitter mathematics of Samuel's choice. As darkness fell, Samuel stood at the edge of the quarters, looking back at the only life he'd known. Moses approached, carrying a small bundle. "I never thought I'd see this day," the older man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I'd die in these fields, get buried in that plot behind the tobacco barn where they put the ones who don't matter." "You matter," Samuel said quietly. "You've always mattered." "What do we do now? Where do we go?" "North," Samuel replied. "We follow the stars north, like the ones who ran before us. Except we have papers. We have proof we're not runaways. We have a chance." Ruth joined them, young Thomas at her side. "Some want to leave tonight," she said. "Don't want to wait till dawn. Don't trust Wellington not to change his mind." "We leave at first light," Samuel said firmly. "We honor the agreement, and we go together. 50 of us, walking out those gates in daylight, free and legal. We owe ourselves that dignity." Through the night, they organized. Samuel divided them into smaller groups, assigned leaders to each group, planned a route that would take them through towns where they might find work or aid. They would head for Maryland first, then Pennsylvania, then further north, where freedom meant more than just a piece of paper. Wellington had kept his word about safe passage, but Samuel knew Virginia was full of men who'd question papers, who'd claim forgery, who'd see 50 freed blacks as either a threat or an opportunity for profit. They would need to be careful, smart, and lucky. As the first grey light of dawn touched the eastern sky, the 50 gathered at the main gate. They stood in silence, each lost in private thoughts, memories of pain and endurance, hopes for an uncertain future, grief for those left behind. Samuel was the last to walk through the gate. He turned back once, seeing the plantation house with its false grandeur, the fields that had drunk his sweat and blood, the quarters where he'd slept and dreamed and survived. 42 years of his life lived in this place, and now he was walking away from it, like it had been nothing but a bad dream. But it hadn't been nothing. It had been everything, every moment of suffering, every small act of resistance, every kindness shared in darkness, every song sung to keep souls from breaking. All of it had led to this moment, to these 50 people walking free. They moved north along the road, a slow procession of the formerly enslaved. Some sang quietly, old spirituals that took on new meaning now. Others walked in stunned silence, unable to fully believe this was real. They walked all that first day, covering perhaps 15 miles before stopping to rest in a clearing off the main road. Samuel watched over them as they settled for the night, his body exhausted but his mind too alert for sleep. They were free now, yes, but freedom was just the beginning. The real question was what came next. Moses sat beside him, sharing a piece of dried meat from his meager supplies. "You think Wellington really found enough gold to make it worth it?" he asked. "I think he found enough to make him happy," Samuel replied. "Whether it makes him rich or not doesn't matter to us anymore." "You ever think about going back?" Moses asked. "To the creek bed, I mean, taking some gold for ourselves?" Samuel shook his head. "That gold nearly cost us our souls. I traded it for something better, our lives. I don't want anything more to do with it." But even as he said it, Samuel thought about the creek bed, about the veins of gold running deep into the earth. He thought about the strange way the rock had felt under his hands, the almost musical quality of the metal when struck. There had been something unnatural about it, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd never told Wellington about the night he'd dug too deep, breaking through into what felt like a hollow space beneath the creek bed. He'd never mentioned the strange symbols he'd found carved into stone down there, or the way the temperature had dropped suddenly, or the feeling that he was being watched from the darkness. He'd covered that hole quickly, taken his gold dust, and never dug that deep again. Some secrets, he thought, were better left buried. 3 days into their journey, the 50 reached a small town called Ashland, just south of the Maryland border. It was barely more than a crossroads, a general store, a blacksmith, a tavern, and a dozen houses scattered among the trees. But it represented a crucial milestone, the last town in Virginia, before they crossed into what they hoped would be greater safety. Samuel sent Ruth and 2 others into the general store to buy supplies, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal. They had pooled what little money some of them had managed to save over years of scarce allowances. It wasn't much, but it might get them through another week if they were careful. While they waited, Samuel noticed a man watching them from the tavern porch. He was thin and weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent too many years doing work that broke the body slowly. After several minutes, the man approached. "That's a lot of colored folks traveling together," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes calculating. "Where you headed?" "North," Samuel replied simply, reaching into his shirt to pull out the sealed document. "We're freedmen. Legal papers signed by Judge Pemberton himself." The man took the document, examining it with the careful attention of someone who couldn't read but knew what official seals should look like. He handed it back with a grunt. "Pemberton, eh? Heard he sealed some strange papers recently. Town's been talking about it. Matthew Wellington going soft or going crazy, depending on who you ask. We're just passing through," Samuel said. "No trouble intended." "Trouble has a way of finding situations like this," the man replied. "You got 50 freed blacks walking through Virginia during harvest season when field hands are worth their weight in tobacco. Some folks might see that as an opportunity, legal papers or not." Samuel felt ice settle in his stomach. "You suggesting something?" "I'm suggesting you keep moving and don't stop till you're well into Maryland, and I'm suggesting you avoid the main roads after dark. There's been talk of patrollers getting aggressive, asking questions first and checking papers later, if you understand my meaning." Samuel understood perfectly. Freedom on paper didn't mean freedom in practice, especially this close to plantation country. The man started to walk away, then turned back. One more thing. About a day north of here, there's an old Quaker settlement. They help people like you sometimes. Look for a house with a black ribbon on the fence post. They'll give you shelter, maybe some food. Tell them Jacob sent you. Why are you helping us? Samuel asked. Jacob shrugged. Used to be a sailing man before I settled here. Saw things on those ships. Cargo that shouldn't have been cargo, if you catch my meaning. Maybe I'm trying to balance the scales a little. He walked away before Samuel could respond. Ruth returned with the supplies, her face troubled. Man in the store was asking questions, wanted to know who owned us, where we came from. I showed him the papers, but he looked at them like he was thinking hard about something. We leave now, Samuel decided. We put distance between us and this town before sunset. They moved quickly through the afternoon, following less traveled paths when possible. Samuel pushed them harder than he wanted to, but Jacob's warning had shaken him. They were vulnerable out here. 50 people who'd spent their lives being property, suddenly trying to navigate a world that didn't want them free. As evening approached, they found a relatively sheltered spot in a grove of oak trees, far enough from the road to avoid casual notice. They made no fire, ate cold rations, and spoke in whispers. Samuel organized watches, making sure someone was always awake and alert. Around midnight, Thomas, who was on watch, woke Samuel with an urgent shake. "Someone's coming," the young man whispered. "Horses, at least 3, maybe more." Samuel rose quickly, moving through the camp to wake the others silently. They gathered in the deepest shadows, the moonlight barely penetrating the oak canopy above them. Samuel could hear it now, the sound of horses moving slowly along the road, men's voices speaking in low tones. "Spread out around here somewhere," one voice said. 50 of them can't have gotten far, not on foot." "You sure they came this way?" another voice asked. "Storekeeper saw them heading north. Papers or no papers, that's a fortune in human capital just walking free. Wellington might have gone mad, but we don't have to. Slave catchers. Despite the legal freedom, despite the sealed documents, they were being hunted." Samuel felt rage and fear war within him. 42 years of slavery, and even freedom couldn't guarantee safety. He touched the document in his shirt, proof of liberty that these men clearly intended to ignore. "What do we do?" Moses whispered beside him. "Stay silent," Samuel breathed. "Don't move. Let them pass." The horses came closer, close enough that Samuel could smell tobacco smoke and whiskey on the air. The slave catchers were moving slowly, scanning the darkness. One of them carried a torch, the flame casting dancing shadows that seemed to reach into the grove where the 50 hid. Then from somewhere behind Samuel came a sound, a child's cough, quickly stifled but too late. One of the group, a woman named Hannah, traveled with her 9-year-old grandson. The boy had been sick for days, his lungs weak from years of breathing cotton dust in the fields. The torch stopped moving. "Did you hear that?" the voice called out. "Came from over there in those trees." The horses turned toward the grove. Samuel's mind raced. They could run, scatter into the darkness, but that would mean splitting up the group, leaving the old and sick vulnerable. They could try to show the papers, but men who hunted humans for profit weren't likely to care about legal documents. Or they could stand their ground. Samuel stepped out of the shadows into the moonlight. "We're here," he called out, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "And we're going nowhere." The riders came forward, 3 men on horseback, all armed. The one with the torch was middle-aged, with a scar running down his left cheek. He looked at Samuel with the expression of someone evaluating livestock. "Well, well," Scarface said. "Looks like we found ourselves a runaway camp." "We're not runaways," Samuel replied, pulling out the sealed document. "We're freedmen, legally emancipated by Matthew Wellington of Wellington Plantation. Papers sealed by Judge Thomas Pemberton of Fredericksburg. We have every right to travel freely." Scarface took the document, held it up to the torchlight, squinted at it. "Fancy words on fancy paper," he said. "How do I know this isn't forged? How do I know you didn't steal this and fill in your own names?" "Because the seal is genuine, and you know it," Samuel said, "and because taking us would be kidnapping, which is a crime even against freed blacks." The other two riders had drawn closer, forming a loose semicircle. Behind Samuel, he could feel the 50 gathering courage, stepping out of the shadows to stand with him. Moses appeared at his right shoulder, Ruth at his left. Young Thomas, despite his fear, stood firm. "Here's what I think," Scarface said, leaning forward in his saddle. "I think papers can be disputed. I think by the time anyone sorts out what's legal and what's not, you'll have spent enough time in a holding pen that you'll wish you'd just come quietly. I think," a new voice cut through the darkness, "I think you should reconsider your current course of action." Everyone turned. A wagon had appeared on the road, driven by a woman in plain grey dress, Quaker clothing. Beside her sat Jacob, the man from Ashland, holding a rifle across his lap. Behind them, the wagon bed held 3 more men, also armed. "Evening, Catherine," Scarface said, his voice losing some of its confidence. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when men with questionable intentions threaten freedmen under the protection of the law," Catherine replied calmly. "I've seen the papers. Judge Pemberton sealed them himself. I was in the courthouse when it happened." "You were there?" Samuel asked, surprised. "I was filing documents for my husband's estate," Catherine said. "I heard Judge Pemberton complain about Matthew Wellington's mad scheme. I remembered because it's not every day 50 people walk free. When Jacob sent word you were coming through, I thought you might appreciate some escort into Maryland." Scarface looked between the wagon and the 50 freedmen, calculating odds. His companions seemed less eager now, faced with witnesses and armed resistance. "This isn't over," Scarface finally said. "Free papers can be lost. Accidents happen on the road. You'd do well to watch your backs." "And you'd do well to remember that kidnapping is a hanging offense," Catherine replied. "Even for men of your profession." The slave catchers turned their horses and rode back into the darkness, disappearing down the road like smoke. Samuel felt his legs go weak with relief. Catherine climbed down from the wagon. "I'm Catherine Morrison. My husband believed that all people should be free. When he died last year, I decided to continue his work. We have a house not far from here, across the Maryland border. You'll be safer there until you can plan your next move." "Why help us?" Moses asked. "We're strangers to you." "Because you're human beings," Catherine said simply, "and because the right thing to do is rarely the easy thing. Now gather your people. We ride before those men work up the courage to return with reinforcements." They loaded the eldest and the sick into the wagon, while the others walked alongside. Catherine led them along back roads and through private property, clearly familiar with routes designed to avoid scrutiny. As dawn broke, they crossed a small river that marked the border into Maryland. Samuel paused on the far bank, looking back at Virginia for the last time. 42 years of his life existed in that state, memories of pain and endurance, of lost family and found fellowship, of humanity preserved in the face of systematic dehumanization. "Good riddance," Ruth said beside him, but there was no triumph in her voice, only exhaustion. "It's not over," Samuel replied quietly. "We're out of Virginia, but we're not safe yet. We're not home yet." "Where is home?" Thomas asked. Samuel considered the question. Where did people go when they'd never been allowed to choose where they lived? Where did you find home when every place you'd known was a prison? "North," he said finally. "Home is north, wherever that turns out to be." Catherine's house was a modest farmstead, but to the 50, it seemed like paradise. She had food prepared, real food, not meager rations, and beds in the barn, clean straw and blankets. For the first time in days, they felt something approaching safety. That night, Catherine sat with Samuel, Moses, and Ruth around her kitchen table, planning the next leg of their journey. Pennsylvania is your best bet, she advised. Philadelphia has a large free black community. They can help you find work, establish yourselves. It's not perfect, nowhere is, but it's better than staying close to the border. How far? Samuel asked. On foot, with your group, 2 weeks, maybe more. The roads aren't safe, so you'll need to travel carefully. I can provide supplies for the journey, and I'll write letters to other friends along the way who might offer shelter. Friends? Ruth asked. Quakers, Catherine explained. We have a network, people committed to helping those escaping slavery or newly freed. It's dangerous work, but it's necessary work. Samuel studied the woman across the table. She was risking everything, her safety, her property, possibly her life, to help them. Why? He asked again. Really, why? Catherine was quiet for a moment, then said, I had a sister, younger than me. When I was 17 and she was 15, she was working in our father's mill. There was an accident. She got caught in the machinery. Catherine's voice remained steady, but her eyes held old pain. She didn't die right away. She lived for 3 days, trapped and broken. And during those 3 days, I learned what it was to be powerless, to watch someone suffer and be unable to help. She looked directly at Samuel. I can't undo what was done to my sister, but I can help prevent suffering when I see it. I can offer freedom to those who've been trapped and broken by a different kind of machinery. That's why. They sat in silence, the weight of shared trauma creating a bond between people from vastly different worlds. Thank you, Samuel said simply. For my sister, for all the sisters and brothers still trapped. Thank you. The next morning, supplied and rested, the 50 prepared to continue their journey. Catherine provided detailed directions, letters of introduction, and enough food for a week. As they gathered to leave, she approached Samuel one final time. There's something you should know, she said quietly. The word about Wellington's gold is spreading. Men are flooding into that area, trying to stake claims, and there are rumors, strange rumors about what's happening there. What kind of rumors? Samuel asked, feeling that old unease return. People disappearing into the mine. Sounds coming from underground, like voices or singing. Workers refusing to go back, claiming the place is cursed. Catherine shook her head. Might be nothing. Might be men's greed creating ghost stories. But I thought you should know, since you were the one who found it. Samuel thought about the hollow space beneath the creek bed, the strange symbols, the feeling of being watched. He'd traded that cursed gold for freedom, and he wanted nothing more to do with it. Whatever's happening there, he said, it's not our concern anymore. We're free now. That's all that matters. Obeys, but as they walked north toward Pennsylvania, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that the gold he'd found was more than just metal in the earth. He'd sensed something ancient about it, something that predated the plantation, perhaps predated even the colonies themselves. He'd found something that maybe wasn't meant to be found, and though he'd walked away from it, he couldn't help but wonder if it would ever truly let him go. The journey to Pennsylvania took 16 days instead of 2 weeks. They traveled slowly, avoiding main roads, moving through forests and along lesser-known paths that Catherine's network had mapped out over years of guiding people north. At night, they found shelter in barns, caves, or hidden camps. During the day, they walked in small groups to avoid drawing attention, reuniting each evening at predetermined locations. Samuel watched his people change during those 16 days. The fear and disbelief that had marked their first steps from Wellington Plantation gradually transformed into something else. Not quite confidence, but a tentative recognition that perhaps this freedom was real, that perhaps they truly had escaped the machinery of bondage. On the 17th day, they crested a hill and saw Philadelphia spread before them. Even from a distance, the city seemed impossibly large, impossibly complex. Samuel had spent his entire life seeing only plantation land, small towns, and rural countryside. The sight of tall buildings and crowded streets was overwhelming. That's where we're going, young Thomas asked, his voice mixing excitement with apprehension. "That's where we start our new lives," Samuel replied, though he felt his own doubts churning beneath the surface. He knew fields and tobacco and survival within the narrow confines of slavery. What did he know about cities, about free life, about building something from nothing? They entered Philadelphia's free black neighborhood as sunset painted the sky orange and purple. The streets were crowded with people of all colors, free blacks, white merchants, immigrants speaking languages Samuel had never heard. The noise was overwhelming. Conversations, arguments, laughter, the rattle of wagons, the cry of street vendors selling everything from bread to buttons. Catherine's letters of introduction led them to a church, where a man named Reverend Morris welcomed them with the weariness of someone who'd seen this scene many times before. Refugees from slavery, arriving with nothing but hope and determination. "We have space in the church basement," Reverend Morris said, his voice carrying the accent of someone originally from the Caribbean. "Not comfortable, but dry and safe. You can stay there while we help you find work and housing. Philadelphia has work if you're willing to labor, but it's not easy. The city doesn't give, it trades your sweat for survival." That first night in the church basement, the 50 lay on blankets spread across a stone floor, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city outside. Samuel found he couldn't sleep. He'd spent 42 years knowing exactly what each day would bring. Wake before dawn, work until dark, survive the overseers, protect what little dignity remained, sleep and repeat. Now tomorrow was a blank page, and he had no idea what to write on it. Moses stirred beside him. "You awake?" "Can't seem to shut my mind down," Samuel admitted. "I've been thinking," Moses said quietly. "All these years, I had one dream, to be free. That was the only dream that mattered. But now that I'm free, I realize I never thought about what comes after. What do I do with freedom?" "I think that's the question we all have to answer," Samuel replied. "And I think the answer is different for each person." Over the following weeks, the 50 began to disperse into the city, each finding their own path. Some found work on the docks, loading and unloading ships. Others became laborers, maids or cooks. A few, like young Thomas, found apprenticeships with free black craftsmen willing to teach trades. Samuel found work at a lumber mill on the edge of the city. The labor was hard, hauling logs, operating saws, loading wagons, but it was honest work, and at the end of each week he received wages, real money that belonged to him, that he could spend or save as he chose. The novelty of choice itself was intoxicating and terrifying. What to eat, where to live, how to spend his time. Decisions he'd never been allowed to make suddenly required constant attention. Sometimes the weight of choice felt heavier than the weight of chains. 3 months into their new lives, Samuel rented a small room above a bakery. It wasn't much, barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it was his. He could lock the door. He could come and go as he pleased. He could sleep without fear of being woken by the overseer's bell. One evening Ruth came to visit. She'd found work as a seamstress and was doing well, her skilled hands finally being compensated fairly for their labor. "Have you heard from the others?" she asked, settling into the room's only chair. "Moses is working at a smithy, learning metalwork. Thomas is apprenticing with a carpenter. Most of the others have found work, though some are struggling." Samuel paused. "We lost 3. Lost how?" "Died. Old age, sickness. Their bodies just gave up once they were free. Like they'd been holding on only through will. And once they had permission to let go, they did." Ruth nodded sadly. "I heard similar stories. Freedom came too late for some." They sat in silence for a moment, honoring those who'd tasted liberty only briefly. "There's something else," Ruth said. "Something strange. You remember Catherine's talk about Wellington's gold mine, about the rumors?" Samuel felt that familiar unease return. "I remember. Word is spreading. People in Philadelphia are talking about it. They're calling it cursed gold. saying that Matthew Wellington went mad, that he disappeared into the mine and never came back out, that the workers all fled, claiming they heard voices underground, saw shadows that moved wrong. "Rumors," Samuel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Ruth agreed, "but there's more. A man came to the church last week asking about you specifically. Said he was a reporter for a newspaper, wanted to write about the slave who discovered gold and traded it for freedom. Reverend Morris turned him away, but he was insistent, said it was the story of the century." Samuel felt ice in his stomach. "Did you tell him anything?" "Of course not. None of us did. But Samuel, people know. The story is out there, and men with money are interested in you. They want to know where you found the gold, what else might be there." "I don't know anything beyond what I told Wellington," Samuel said firmly, "and even if I did, I wouldn't go back. That place—" He trailed off, remembering the strange symbols, the hollow space, the feeling of ancient eyes watching from darkness. "What?" Ruth pressed. "What aren't you saying?" Samuel stood and walked to the small window overlooking the street below. "When I was digging, looking for gold, I went deeper one night than I should have. I broke through into some kind of chamber underground. There were carvings on the walls, symbols I'd never seen before, and there was—" He hesitated. "What?" "A feeling. Like the place was alive somehow. Like I'd disturbed something that had been sleeping. I covered that hole quickly, took what gold I could from the shallow veins, and never dug deep again." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "What do you think was down there?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know. I traded that gold for our freedom, and that's where the story ends for me. Whatever's happening at Wellington Plantation now, whatever Wellington found or didn't find, it's not my concern." But even as he said it, Samuel knew it wasn't true. The gold had bought their freedom, yes, but at what cost? Had he traded one kind of bondage for another, less visible but equally inescapable? That night, Samuel dreamed for the first time in months. He dreamed of the creek bed, of digging deeper and deeper, of breaking through into vast caverns filled with gold that sang in voices like grinding stones. He dreamed of figures moving in the darkness, of hands reaching up from below, of something ancient and hungry, waking from centuries of sleep. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. Outside, Philadelphia was beginning its morning routine. Vendors setting up, workers heading to their jobs, life continuing in its relentless urban rhythm. Samuel went to work at the lumber mill as usual, but the dream stayed with him, clinging to his thoughts like smoke. As he hauled logs and operated saws, he found himself thinking about Wellington, about what had happened to the man who'd owned him for 42 years. Had Wellington found more gold? Had he become rich beyond measure? Or had he discovered something else entirely in those underground chambers? And why did Samuel care? He was free now. What happened to his former owner should matter nothing to him. But it did matter, because Samuel had been the one to find the gold. He'd been the one to disturb whatever lay beneath the earth, and if something terrible had been unleashed, he bore some responsibility for that. A week later, the choice was taken from him. He was leaving work one evening when 3 men approached him on the street. They were well-dressed, professional-looking, the kind of men who made money from other people's labor. "Samuel?" the lead man asked. "Samuel from Wellington Plantation?" Every instinct Samuel had developed over 4 decades of survival screamed danger. "Who's asking?" "My name is Harrison Fletcher. I represent a consortium of investors interested in the Wellington property. We'd like to speak with you about the gold you discovered." "I don't know anything," Samuel said, moving to walk past them. One of the other men stepped into his path. "We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for your assistance. $500 just to return to the site and show us where you found the gold. $500. More money than Samuel could earn in 2 years at the lumber mill, enough to buy a small house, to help others who'd come north seeking freedom, to build something real and permanent. "I'm not interested," Samuel said, his voice harder than he felt. "We know about the stories," Fletcher said. "The rumors about the mine being cursed, about Wellington's disappearance. We're not fools. We don't believe in ghosts or curses, but we do believe in gold, and we believe you know more than you've told anyone. So here's our offer. $500 now, another 1,000 if the site proves as valuable as we believe. That's money that could change your life." "My life already changed," Samuel replied. "I'm free. That's all the change I need." "Think about it," Fletcher pressed. "We're staying at the Continental Hotel. You have 3 days to decide. After that, we'll find someone else, someone who might not have your moral qualms about what happened to Wellington." They walked away, leaving Samuel standing on the street corner, his mind racing. $500, a fortune. But at what cost? That night, he gathered Moses, Ruth, and young Thomas in his room. He told them about the offer, about Fletcher and his investors. "Don't do it," Moses said immediately. "Nothing good can come from going back there." But the money," Thomas said hesitantly. "That's enough to help so many people. Think of all the freed blacks struggling to survive in this city. $500 could change lives." "Or it could end them," Ruth said quietly. "Samuel, you felt something wrong about that place. You said so yourself. Why would you go back?" "Because maybe I left something unfinished," Samuel admitted. "Because maybe whatever's happening there is partly my fault. Because I disturbed something that shouldn't have been disturbed, and now a man is missing, possibly dead, because of gold I found. Wellington chose his own fate," Moses said firmly. "You don't owe him anything. You don't owe those investors anything. You owe yourself peace, Samuel. You've earned it." Samuel knew Moses was right, but he also knew he wouldn't have peace, not really, until he understood what he'd found beneath that creek bed. "I need to think," he said finally. "I have 3 days. Let me think." For 2 days, Samuel wrestled with the decision. He worked at the lumber mill, went through the motions of his life, but his mind was elsewhere, trapped between past and future, between safety and responsibility. On the morning of the 3rd day, he made his decision. He went to the Continental Hotel and asked for Harrison Fletcher. "I'll take you to the site," Samuel said when Fletcher came down to the lobby. "But there are conditions. I want the $500 in advance, in writing, signed and witnessed, and I want it understood that I'm just showing you where I found gold. I'm not responsible for what you do or don't find there." Fletcher smiled, the expression of a man who'd known all along he'd get what he wanted. "Agreed. We leave tomorrow morning." Samuel returned to his room and wrote a letter to Moses, Ruth, and Thomas. He explained his decision, asked them to use the money wisely if something happened to him, and told them that he loved them as the family he'd chosen when blood family had been stolen away. Then he packed a small bag and prepared to return to Virginia, to the place he'd sworn never to see again, to confront whatever waited in the darkness beneath the earth. The journey south felt like traveling backward through time. Each mile brought Samuel closer to a past he'd tried to leave behind, each familiar landmark a reminder of the life he'd escaped. By the time they reached the boundaries of what had been Wellington Plantation, Samuel's hands were trembling. The plantation had changed. The main house stood empty, windows dark and broken. The fields had gone wild, tobacco plants rotting unharvested among weeds that had reclaimed the land with violent speed. The slave quarters where Samuel had lived for 42 years were abandoned, doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-scream. "What happened here?" Fletcher asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. "Whatever you're about to find out," Samuel replied quietly. They rode down to the creek bed as evening approached. Fletcher had brought 5 men with him, workers, guards, investors, all eager to see the gold that had spawned so many rumors. But as they drew closer to the site, their enthusiasm began to waver. The creek bed had been excavated extensively. Someone, Wellington presumably, had dug deep into the earth, following the veins of gold Samuel had found. But the excavation looked wrong. The earth around the pit was blackened, as if burned. The hole itself seemed to breathe, a faint warm wind emerging from its depths, carrying an odor that reminded Samuel of ancient tombs and forgotten places. "This is it," Samuel said, dismounting from the horse Fletcher had provided. "This is where I found the first vein." Fletcher's men approached the pit cautiously, peering down into darkness that seemed to extend far beyond what simple mining should have revealed. One of them lowered a lantern on a rope, the light descending into the earth, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely without reaching bottom. "How deep does it go?" Fletcher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Deeper than it should," Samuel replied. One of Fletcher's men, a burly worker named Garrett, volunteered to be lowered down to investigate. They rigged ropes and pulleys, and slowly Garrett descended into the pit, his lantern creating a moving circle of light against walls that glistened with moisture and something else. Veins of gold running through the rock like frozen lightning. For 10 minutes they heard nothing but the creak of rope and Garrett's occasional call of "lower." Then the rope went slack. "Garrett?" Fletcher called down. "Do you see anything?" No response. "Garrett?" A sound came from the pit, not words, but something between a laugh and a sob. Then Garrett's voice, distorted and strange. Oh God, there's so much gold, and they're here. They're all here. They've been waiting." "Pull him up," Fletcher ordered. The men hauled on the rope, but it came up too easily. When the end emerged from the pit, it had been cut clean through, as if by something impossibly sharp. The warm wind from below intensified, and with it came a sound. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in languages that predated English, predated the colonies, perhaps predated human settlement of this continent. The sound rose and fell like a tide, carrying within it recognition, hunger, and something that might have been gratitude. "We need to leave," Samuel said urgently. "Now. We need to leave right now." But Fletcher was staring into the pit, his face illuminated by a glow that seemed to come from below. Not lantern light, but something else. Something that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. "There's so much gold down there," Fletcher whispered. "I can see it. Walls of it. Mountains of it. Enough to make us all rich beyond measure." "Fletcher, listen to me." Samuel grabbed the man's shoulder. "That's not gold. Or it's not just gold. It's something else. Something that uses gold to lure people. Something that's been waiting down there for..." The ground beneath them shuddered. Cracks appeared in the earth around the pit, spreading outward like a spider's web. The voices from below grew louder, more insistent. Fletcher's remaining men were already running, their greed overcome by primal fear. But Fletcher himself seemed rooted in place, unable to look away from whatever he saw in the depths. Samuel made a choice. He'd come back here for answers, for closure, for understanding. But some things weren't meant to be understood. Some doors weren't meant to be opened. He grabbed Fletcher bodily and dragged him away from the pit. The man fought him, clawing at Samuel's arms, screaming about the gold, about the fortune that awaited just below. The ground shook harder. The pit began to collapse inward, earth and stone falling into darkness that seemed to have no end. Samuel ran, half-carrying Fletcher, as behind them the entire creek bed caved in with a roar like thunder. They reached the horses just as the collapse accelerated. Samuel threw Fletcher across a saddle, mounted his own horse, and rode. Behind them the earth continued to fall, creating a crater that swallowed the creek bed, the surrounding fields, everything within 100 yards of where Samuel had first found gold 6 months ago. They rode until dawn, putting miles between themselves and Wellington Plantation. When they finally stopped at a small inn, Fletcher had regained some semblance of sanity. He sat in the common room, staring at nothing, his hands shaking. "What was that?" he finally asked. "What was down there?" Samuel considered how to answer. "How did you explain something you didn't fully understand yourself?" "I think," he said slowly, "that the gold was a lure. I think something old, older than this country, older than the people who lived here before colonization, something was buried there, trapped maybe, or sleeping. And the gold was bait, meant to draw people down, to feed whatever waited below. Wellington, Fletcher whispered. All those workers who disappeared, they were fed, Samuel finished, consumed, used as sustenance for something that had been starving for centuries, and I nearly served you all up on a platter. Fletcher looked at Samuel with new eyes, seeing perhaps for the first time not a former slave or a guide or a means to wealth, but a man who'd saved his life. "The $500, Fletcher said. "Take it. Take it all. I'm done with this. I'm done with Virginia, done with gold, done with all of it." Samuel took the money but found no satisfaction in it. He'd come south seeking answers and found only more questions. What had been buried beneath Wellington Plantation? Who had put it there and why? How many others had been consumed before Samuel discovered the gold? He thought about Wellington, the man who'd owned him, who'd traded his freedom for gold, who'd literally dug his own grave in pursuit of wealth. Was there justice in that? Samuel didn't know. He knew only that he wanted no more of it. He returned to Philadelphia alone, Fletcher having decided to head north to Boston, as far from Virginia as he could reasonably get. The journey back took longer than the journey south, as if Samuel's horse sensed his reluctance to return to the city, to explain what had happened, to face the questions he couldn't answer. When he finally arrived at his room above the bakery, he found Moses, Ruth, and Thomas waiting. "We heard what happened," Moses said, "or some of it anyway. Stories are spreading about the collapse, about the crater where Wellington Plantation used to be. People are saying it was divine judgment, that God punished the plantation for the sin of slavery." "Maybe he did," Samuel said tiredly. "Or maybe something older than God was down there. I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know." Ruth embraced him. "You're back. That's what matters. You went down there and came back. That's more than most can say." Over the following days, Samuel gave Fletcher's money to the church, asking Reverend Morris to use it to help newly freed blacks establish themselves in Philadelphia. He wanted nothing from that cursed gold, not even money earned by almost dying near it. He returned to work at the lumber mill, fell back into the rhythms of free life, tried to forget about what he'd seen beneath the earth. But the dreams continued. Visions of vast caverns, of gold that sang with voices of the consumed, of something ancient and patient, waiting for the next fool who'd dig too deep in search of easy wealth. 1 month later, a letter arrived at the church addressed to Samuel. Reverend Morris brought it to him at the lumber mill, his face troubled. "This came from a lawyer in Richmond," the Reverend said. "I don't know if you want to open it." Samuel took the letter, feeling its weight. He opened it carefully and read, "Dear Samuel, this letter is being sent to you as per the instructions left by Matthew Wellington in his last will and testament. I am writing to inform you that Mr. Wellington's body was recovered from the mine collapse on his property. Before his death, he amended his will to include a provision regarding you specifically. Mr. Wellington wished me to convey that he understood at the end what you had tried to tell him, that some wealth is too expensive to claim. He wanted you to know that you saved more lives than you'll ever know by walking away from that gold. He also left you something. Enclosed is the deed to 20 acres of land in western Pennsylvania, purchased in your name. It is free and clear, yours to do with as you wish. Mr. Wellington's note indicated that this was payment of a debt, not for showing him the gold, but for trying to stop him from following it too far. Sincerely, Jonathan Marks, Attorney at Law. Samuel read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket. 20 acres, land of his own, not worked as a slave, but owned as a free man. It was more than he'd ever dreamed possible during those 42 years in bondage. But it came at a cost. Wellington's life, Garrett's life, and who knew how many others consumed by whatever waited in the dark beneath the earth. Good news or bad? Reverend Morris asked. Both, Samuel replied. Always both. 5 years passed. Samuel used Wellington's bequest to purchase more land adjacent to the original 20 acres, creating a small farm in western Pennsylvania where he grew wheat and raised chickens. It wasn't much, but it was his, every inch of it bought with honest labor rather than blood and bondage. Moses came to live with him, the two old men building a life together based on shared history and mutual respect. They hired freed blacks when they needed extra help during harvest, paying fair wages and treating workers with dignity. It was, they both agreed, the antithesis of everything Wellington Plantation had represented. Ruth married a carpenter and opened a dress shop in Philadelphia. Thomas became a skilled craftsman, eventually taking over his master's workshop when the old man retired. Of the original 50 freed from Wellington Plantation, 43 survived those first crucial 5 years, beating odds that saw most freed slaves die or return to bondage within that time frame. They stayed in touch, the 50 who'd walked free together, meeting annually in Philadelphia to remember those they'd lost and celebrate those who'd survived. At the 5th annual gathering, Ruth raised a glass in toast. "To Samuel," she said, "who found gold and had the wisdom to trade it for something more valuable, our lives." "To the 50, Samuel replied, "who proved that freedom is possible, that survival is possible, that building a life after bondage is possible." They drank, laughed, told stories, and for a few hours pretended that the world was simpler than it was, that freedom meant safety, that the battles were behind them. But Samuel knew better. He read newspapers, heard stories from travelers, understood that slavery was spreading, not receding, that the nation was moving toward some kind of confrontation that would make the collapse of Wellington Plantation look like a minor tremor before a major earthquake. Still, he had his land, his friend, his community of fellow survivors. He had enough. Or so he thought, until the morning Moses came running from the fields, his face pale, holding something he'd unearthed while ploughing. It was a piece of metal, roughly the size of a man's palm, covered in the same strange symbols Samuel had seen in the chamber beneath Wellington's creek bed. It gleamed with an inner light that had nothing to do with the sun. "Samuel," Moses said, his voice shaking, "there's more. I found a whole seam of them, buried about 3 feet down. And Samuel, they're warm like they're alive." Samuel took the piece of metal, felt its unnatural heat, saw symbols that seemed to shift and change when looked at directly. He thought about the gold beneath Wellington Plantation, about the voices from below, about something ancient and hungry that had waited centuries to be found. "We're not digging there anymore," Samuel said firmly. "We're covering it back up, ploughing it deep, and never touching that field again." "But what if it spreads?" Moses asked. "What if it's like the gold? What if it attracts people, lures them in?" "Then we guard it," Samuel replied. "We make sure no one digs there. We pass the knowledge to people we trust, people who understand that some things are better left buried." They spent that day covering the excavation, filling it in, planting it over with fast-growing grass. But Samuel knew it was a temporary solution. Whatever had been beneath Wellington Plantation wasn't unique to that location. It was part of something larger, a network of buried things waiting to be discovered across the land. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. He stood outside his farmhouse, looking up at stars that had witnessed countless human struggles, countless rises and falls of civilizations. He thought about slavery, about how it had been justified by calling enslaved people less than human, property to be bought and sold. But what if there were things that saw all humans the same way, as resources to be consumed, as fuel for purposes beyond human understanding? The gold had been a test, he realized. Not a test of greed. Greed was too human, too simple. It was a test of curiosity, of the drive that made humans dig and explore and uncover secrets. It was a trap designed specifically for intelligent, curious species, baited with wealth that any advancing civilization would value. And Samuel had sprung that trap. Not out of greed, but out of desperation, out of the need to buy freedom for himself and others. Did that make it better or worse? Moses joined him outside. Can't sleep either. Too much thinking, Samuel admitted. You know what I've learned in these 5 years? Moses said. I've learned that being free doesn't mean being without burdens. It just means we get to choose our burdens. You chose to carry this knowledge, this responsibility of guarding whatever's buried under our land. That's heavy, Samuel, heavier than any chain. Someone has to carry it, Samuel replied. Better it be someone who understands the cost, who won't be tempted to dig, who knows that some wealth isn't worth claiming. They stood in silence, 2 old men who'd survived slavery, survived freedom, survived knowledge that most would consider curse or blessing, depending on their perspective. What do we do? Moses finally asked. How do we make sure this stays buried, not just for our lifetimes, but beyond? Samuel thought about Catherine Morrison, about the Quaker network that had helped them reach safety. He thought about the church in Philadelphia, about Reverend Morris and the community of freed blacks who'd established systems of mutual support and protection. We tell the story, Samuel decided. Not all of it. People aren't ready for all of it. But we tell enough. We make sure that people know this land is protected, that it's sacred ground, that disturbing it brings consequences. We turn it into legend, into myth, into something that keeps people away, without them knowing exactly why. You want to turn truth into story? Moses asked. Story is how truth survives, Samuel replied. History gets rewritten, facts get forgotten, but stories embed themselves in people's minds, get passed down, mutate and evolve, but retain their essential message. We tell a story about cursed land, about gold that brings death, about the man who found wealth and chose freedom instead. We make sure that story spreads, gets embellished, becomes something people remember. Over the following years, that's exactly what they did. Samuel became known as a storyteller, traveling to churches and gatherings of freed blacks, telling tales about his discovery of gold, his bargain with Wellington, and the terrible fate that befell those who pursued wealth too eagerly. He embellished, dramatized, added elements of horror and warning. The story spread, mutated, grew. Some versions claimed Wellington had been dragged to hell by demons. Others said the gold was cursed by native spirits angry at their land being stolen. Still others transformed it into a cautionary tale about the sin of greed, the danger of valuing wealth over humanity. But beneath all the variations, the core message remained. Some things are better left buried, some wealth is too expensive to claim, and the true treasure is freedom, the freedom to choose, to build, to love, to live without chains. Samuel lived to be 73 years old, a remarkable age for someone who'd spent most of his life in bondage. On his deathbed, surrounded by Moses, Ruth, Thomas, and children of the original 50 who'd walked free together, he shared his final thoughts. I spent 42 years as property, he said, his voice weak but clear. Then I found something that could have made me rich, that could have bought comfort and luxury. Instead, I traded it for the most valuable thing in the world, the right to be human, the right to choose. I've never regretted that trade, not once. What about the things buried on your land? Moses asked quietly. What should we do with those? Keep them buried, Samuel replied. Pass that responsibility to people you trust. Make sure the story survives, even if the details get lost. Promise me, they promised. Samuel died on a spring morning, his hand held by friends he'd freed, on land he owned, a free man. The farm passed to Moses, then to Thomas, then to their children and grandchildren. Over the generations, the story of Samuel and the cursed gold became local legend, then regional folklore, then a footnote in history books about the era of slavery. But the land remained protected. The family that descended from the original 50 maintained it, kept it fallow, told their children about the man who'd found gold and chosen freedom, about the danger of digging too deep, about the responsibility of guarding secrets that protected not just their family, but perhaps all of humanity. In the 1950s, when developers wanted to build housing on the land, the family refused to sell at any price. In the 1980s, when mining companies surveyed the area and detected unusual mineral deposits, the family blocked access through legal means. In the early 2000s, when archaeologists sought permission to excavate what they suspected might be pre-Columbian artifacts, the family declined. Each generation told the story differently, but always with the same core truth. Samuel found something that could have brought wealth, and he chose freedom instead. He found something buried that should stay buried, and he spent his free years making sure it remained that way. The story of the slave who discovered gold on the plantation and traded the secret for his freedom became a story about wisdom over greed, about the price of freedom, about the responsibilities that come with knowledge. But it was also a story about what lies beneath, the things humans find when they dig, the ancient hungers that wait in darkness, the cost of curiosity, and the courage required to walk away from answers. Samuel understood that some questions shouldn't be asked, some doors shouldn't be opened, some gold shouldn't be claimed. He understood that freedom wasn't just the absence of chains, it was the right to choose what burdens to carry and which ones to leave buried. He found gold and traded it for freedom. He discovered what waited below and chose to guard the world from it. He lived as a slave and died as a free man who'd saved not just himself, but perhaps countless others from pursuing wealth that wore a friendly face while hiding hunger, ancient as the earth itself. That was his legacy, not the gold he found, but the gold he walked away from. Not the wealth he could have claimed, but the wisdom to understand that some treasures are too expensive to possess. And in the end, that wisdom proved more valuable than any amount of gold, more powerful than any curse, more enduring than any empire built on the backs of enslaved people. Samuel's story survived because it was true in the ways that matter most, true to the human cost of slavery, true to the courage required for freedom, true to the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from what everyone else is running toward. The gold beneath Wellington Plantation was never excavated. The crater eventually filled with water, becoming a small lake that locals avoided, claiming it was haunted, claiming that on certain nights you could hear voices singing from its depths. The land Samuel had farmed remained in the family, protected and guarded, its secrets staying buried. And the story of the slave who found gold and chose freedom lived on, told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying the essential message that Samuel had understood that day he walked away from Wellington Plantation. Freedom is the only treasure worth finding. Everything else is just metal in the earth, waiting to consume those foolish enough to dig too deep.